Good evening and welcome to this episode of Historical Sketches, where I will draw a parallel between our current historical moment and the phase of the French Revolution referred to as Jacobinism. Then I will review some overlooked background of the French Revolution proper, and I will also briefly review some corresponding and relevant aspects of the Bolshevik Revolution, from all of which we may derive parallels with the current historical moment and perhaps parallels with the long predicted and obscurely anticipated New World Order revolution. Needless to say, though the evidence is often compelling, the future is ever an enigma, for, to quote Julius Caesar, what can be avoided that whose end is purposed by the mighty gods? To start, because it is necessary to shorten in order to remember, in the collective mind, the French Revolution happened because the people were hungry, and the spiteful Queen Marie Antoinette told the Parisians that if they did not have bread, they could as well eat cake, whereupon the crowd became angry and cut the heads of both king and queen. The matter was somewhat more complicated, and in this episode I will outline some lesser-known historical threads. They may cast a different light on the French Revolution as a historical phenomenon, a perspective that may also give us some clues on how to interpret the history of our times. Today, at least as far as America is concerned, we could say that America is living through the equivalent of the Jacobin phase of the French Revolution. Now, the Jacobins constituted the faction that came to power during the extreme and bloodiest phase of the revolution and signaled the beginning of its end, where the end product of the revolution turned out to be Napoleon Bonaparte. But it was during the Jacobin phase of the revolution that the guillotine was most active, a point that may have given some reason to Margaret Thatcher, an otherwise sufficiently hated figure in British history, to say, Margaret Thatcher, that all the French Revolution produced was a heap of headless corpses and a tyrant. To give some anecdotal background about the Jacobins, during the relatively short time of their ascendance, they changed the name of the 12 months to reflect the agricultural aspect of the seasons. For example, translated, January was snowy, February was rainy, March was windy, and so on. The week was converted from 7 to 10 days, and the weeks themselves were no longer called weeks, but decades, which meant, by the way, that while under the repressive monarchical regime workers had to work for 6 days and rest on the 7th, now after the Jacobin liberation they had to work for 9 days and rest on the 10th. The days, instead of being called Monday, Tuesday, etc., were to be called first, second, third, or rather in French, primodi, duodi, tridi, and so forth. A group of 4 years ending in the leap year was called the Franciade, which we could translate as a French thing. And this to commemorate that it had taken 4 years since the start of the revolution in 1789 to arrive at the establishment of the French Republic in 1793. The Jacobins even tried to decimalize time, 20 hours per day instead of 24, but it proved too complicated and they didn't succeed in this transformation. And finally, God was turned into a goddess, the goddess of reason. The Jacobin phase of the revolution did not last long. Eventually the reaction was such that the Jacobins themselves had their heads cut off by the guillotine that they used proficiently and profusely during their relatively short time. This was a long introduction, but there is a reason. It could be said that we are now in the Jacobin phase of the current American Revolution, because just as the Jacobins wanted the French to believe a number of things that were not true, Americans, and really we could say the Western world at large, are asked to believe lies, or as Shakespeare would say, lies that are like the father that begets them, gross as a mountain, open and palpable. Examples. There are as many sexes as we can imagine. Looting is acceptable as reparation for previous oppression. The family is an old structure reminiscent of authoritarian impositions, a paternalistic approach to life inhibiting liberty, freedom and development. That there are no races except one that cannot be mentioned. That the only reason why humans are still alive is because of corporate medicine and of thousands of different, not to say harmful or deadly, different pills. Furthermore, as we all know, this is the reality inculcated into the mass mind by the monopolistic media, supplemented, fed, maintained and supported by an equally monopolistic academic, intellectually racketeering system that retails ridiculous fields of study and idiotic ideas detrimental to society at large. At least that's the way I see it. Altogether, this contributes to create a well-defined mass mind and to feed and maintain an essentially racketeering society where, out of the chaos, as many leeches and looters as it can accommodate make money by any possible dishonest means. Afghanistan is but one example, which we may consider a latter-day appendix of an updated Jacobin revolution. And in this respect, I would agree with Biden that Afghanistan was actually a success. It does not matter how many people were killed during 20 years, just consider how many people have grown immensely rich through the trillions thrown at Afghanistan to keep up and maintain the machinery of appearance. But I digress. In a necessarily limited time, my intent is to demonstrate that there is a general trend among revolutions and upheavals, a trend towards not just solving local problems, but towards creating a new world order altogether. With the French Revolution, the New World Order eventually halted at or with Napoleon, who in turn wanted to create a New World Order based on French exceptionalism. The plan advanced pretty well until it crashed at Waterloo in 1815. And I will omit in this panorama the other two failed French revolutions of 1848 and 1871. The Bolshevik Revolution equally aimed at creating a new world order, and in the thought of Lenin and Trotsky at least. And as we know, and broadly speaking, the goal was deflected when Stalin decided that before establishing a new world order, it was necessary to establish a brand new domestic order. And we know how the whole thing ended. However, before the current Western revolution in progress, aimed at a new world order, of which many believe that the pandemic is an integral part, there was another one, whose trigger was the totally unnecessary explosion of the 2 atomic bombs in Japan in 1945. This aspect of history is usually neglected or overlooked, and depending on available time, in this or in another episode, I will also attempt to describe that interrupted world revolution. Suffice to say that Ben-Gurion, one of Israel's founders, predicted after World War II that by 1999 there would be no nations and the world capital, there would be one world and the world capital would be in Israeli Jerusalem. So far it has not happened. It has not happened yet simply because only the witches of Macbeth can look with precision into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not. Now, back to the French Revolution and to some related and generally overlooked aspects. We associate the 18th century with the Age of Enlightenment and with the resurgence of a new freedom of thought thanks to the efforts and production of the great philosophers or philosophes, as they call them, especially the French Voltaire, Rousseau and Diderot with his encyclopedia and so forth. Therefore, it seems befitting that the first revolution embodying this principle would occur in France, except that it didn't. For this, we must refer to what is today Holland or the Netherlands, where, in the Netherlands, in 1783, a rebellion broke out against William V, called the Stadtholder. For simplicity, we can call it the equivalent of a king, standard king. On one side, there were the supporters of William V, called the Orangists, and on the other, the Patriots, the revolutionaries, who wanted a more egalitarian society. Eventually, William V had to flee his palace, as the troops did not want to fight the Patriots, and the Patriots had gathered a militia of their own. At that point, Frederick II of Prussia sent his army of 20,000 soldiers, and the revolution of the Patriots ended. Prussia was an ally of England, which caused the Dutch patriot to say, quote, "The English endeavor to enslave everyone and keep themselves free." The important point is that strategically and politically, the objectives of England were to promote revolution in Catholic countries, but suppress it at home and in countries ruled by Protestant allies, as it was the case in Holland. Which does not mean that there were no rebellions or riots in England. One particularly notorious went down in history as the Peterloo Massacre that took place at St. Peter's Field near Manchester in Lancashire in England on Monday, 16th of August of 1819. Furthermore, though some idealists may think otherwise, no revolution can happen without money. The best that peaceful revolutions can muster are demonstrations that, in the rare case when they threaten to galvanize public opinion, are put down either by force or starvation or denigration or a combination of the three. A very example of denigration is shown, as I'm recording this episode, by the attitude of the central Canadian government towards the truckers who drove to Ottawa to demonstrate against the COVID restrictions. With the French Revolution, both money and organization came from or thanks to Freemasonry. This is not an isolated opinion. Among those who proved it was Augustin Barruel, one of the historians who wrote, among many, who wrote a history of the French Revolution. But, along with money, a revolution should have a religion. And the French Revolution had its ecclesiastical hierarchy and organization in the order of Freemasonry. In fact, Freemasonry was instrumental in establishing numerous societies or clubs which provided the practical and theoretical basis for the revolution. The French clubs were the link between the Masonic Lodge of the Nine Sisters, established in 1776, and the revolutionary government after the fall of the old regime. We could say that the clubs were the churches of the new religion. As an oddity, a crucial role in the passage from the Masonic clubs to the revolution proper was, one would have thought that he was the most unlikely imaginable character, he was Philip, the Duke of Orleans, who later renamed himself as Philippe Égalité. He was the cousin of the king, and the inspirer of underground agitations and intrigues that have never been completely unraveled. The hub and connection among the revolutionary clubs, cafes, brothels, and publishers of the revolutionary material was the Palais Royal, the princely residence of Philippe. From this palace, where the desire of reform moved through revolt, through revolution, Philip tried to create a kind of British island in Paris, where French Anglophiles would imitate the debate of reforms as they were debated in English coffee houses. The original French radicals wanted to create an English-style political class in France, where the liberal nobility would collaborate with the enlightened bourgeoisie, and the Palais Royal was the heart of this movement. Another point to consider in examining revolutions from the more extreme Protestant revolutions of the 16th century to the French and the Bolshevik revolutions is that the lure of sexual liberation is an essential ingredient for the establishment of political control. The French radicals turned the Palais Royal into a center of low pleasure, specializing in political pornography, with publications such as the National Bordello under the auspices of the Queen, and in fact this was a campaign of gross disinformation before its times. Marie Antoinette, while no emblem of humility, had genuine charitable instinct towards poor people. After all, she was the daughter of Empress Marie-Thérèse of Austria and had been strictly brought up, as was the rule for royal princesses destined from birth to become queens of other countries through marriage. But after 1799, her opposition to the French Revolution made Marie Antoinette one of the most hated figures in the country, and misogynistic journalists depicted her as a murderous, hedonistic, sexually insatiable lesbian plotting to betray the country to France's enemy. The Duke of Orléans, Philippe Égalité, hired as his personal secretary a Monsieur de la Closse, author of Les Liaisons Dangereuses, The Dangerous Connections, the story of two noblemen and narcissistic rivals who use seduction as a weapon to socially control and exploit others. Another hire was the more famous Marquis de Sade, from whose name we have derived the adjective sadistic. De Sade is a figure that well represents a certain spirit of the French Revolution as a whole, and as well as the liberated pornography that flourished during the revolutionary era. The Palais Royal became notorious for its prostitutes, the most notorious of whom was Madame de Genlis, the mistress of the Duke. I'm quoting from a chronicle of the time. The prostitutes who gathered in the gardens of the Palais Royal made sure that every form of sexual gratification described in the pornography produced there in the palace was available in the cafes and department of the Palace complex. Providing the intoxicating atmosphere of unearthly utopia, we could say, and again I'm quoting, the cafes also incited those who frequented them to act on the politics of desire, as they called them, and to bring down the government that inhibited their pleasure and their political fantasies. If distinctions of rank were obliterated in these cafes and men were free to exercise a sexual as well as a political freedom, then the Palais Royal, called the Temple of Voluptuousness, was destined to become the birthplace of the revolution. The association between revolution and unrestrained sexual passion, branded as freedom, is as old as Plato the philosopher. At the Palais Royal, the French radicals, clouded by sexual passion and the pleasures of drugs and alcohol, mistook fantasy for reality, and the ideal of total secular happiness began to seem credible as well as desirable. 150 approximate years later, in the context of the Bolshevik Revolution, the part played by Philippe, Duke of Orléans, was played by a woman called Alexandra Kollontai. Kollontai on the trail of Marx, Engels, and the utopian socialist of the 19th century, saw marriage and the family as an essential part of the capitalist system of ownership and exchange. And according to this view, women were but property, and morals were simply a system whereby women were kept under control for the benefit of their exploiters. Religion, by reinforcing morals, reinforces the unjust exploitation of the worker. And from these ideas, it followed that women were especially susceptible to exploitation through their religious feelings and superstition. The socialist solution, with the abolition of property, would lead to relations between the sexes based on love, which for the Bolshevik theologians, or theoreticians if you like, was but a natural instinct. It followed that with the abolition of property, a new system of sexual morality would be established based not on property but what they called on spiritual affinity. This meant a completely new moral system based on the subjective states of mind that determined the morality of all sexual action. And this subjective state of mind was called, as I said, spiritual affinity. And if a man suddenly lost this spiritual affinity, then he was no longer married and free to seek sexual vocations elsewhere based on a new spiritual affinity. Concurring with this mode of thought was Engels, Marx's partner. Engels' idea that women's liberation could become possible only when women were enabled to take part in industrial production on a large social scale, which, unsaid, meant that women could only become liberated by working outside of the home. Equally left unsaid was that liberation for women meant transferring the benefits of women's labor from their immediate family to the benefit of factory owners, be they the capitalists or, as in Russia after the revolution, the state. Kollontai served as People's Commissar for Welfare in Vladimir Lenin's government in 1917 to 1918. But 5 years later, in 1922, sexual liberation was no longer very popular. Birth rate had fallen dramatically. There were 7 million orphans, over 11 million dead, rampant venereal disease, and more prostitution than under the Tsars. Whereupon Kollontai was sent to Norway as ambassador of the Soviet Union. She still clung to their ideas and anticipated that by 1970 the family would have died out throughout the world. Her predictions did not materialize, but there are curious echoes of a parallel mode of thought in some developments of contemporary life. The exaltation, for lack of a better word, of various forms of what once was called sodomy is an example, along with the idea that race is a colonialist construct and sex attribution is optional, with the unobjectionable consequence that a man may declare himself a woman and thus compete with obvious advantage in sports reserved to women by pretending that he is one of them, or if a criminal, by choosing to be jailed with women so as to be able to rape them with ease. And though at the moment it is officially branded as a conspiracy theory, the Great Reset is an expression that has become familiar, partly due to the COVID phenomenon and partly to its creator, the somewhat ambiguous figure of Karl Schwab, master of the so-called World Economic Forum. And according to current theory, the Great Reset is the global elite's plan to install a communist world order by abolishing private property while using COVID-19 to solve overpopulation and enslaving what remains of humanity with vaccines. Anyway, even Lenin, who had chosen Kollontai as Commissar for Welfare, declared that, and I quote, "The present widespread hypertrophy in sexual matters does not give joy and force to life, but takes it away. And in the age of revolution, this is bad, very bad." Good for Lenin. But returning to the French Revolution, it began on July the 12th, 1789, at the Palais Royal that I mentioned before and described, which belonged to the Duke Philippe, which was a privilege. The Palais Royal was a privileged sanctuary for intellectuals who could turn speculation into organization. Besides, the Palais Royal also provided a living link with the underworld of Paris and with the new social forces that had to be mobilized for a revolutionary victory. The Minister of War of King Louis XVI had indisputable evidence of the intrigues of England and Prussia, who gave money to the Duke of Orleans, who was very wealthy in his own, just by himself. And English money was found on the first rioters, and Englishmen were seen mingling with the mobs during the first days of the revolution. Because. According to some historians, England was worried because King Louis XVI was enthusiastic about the navy and wanted to open the port of Cherbourg, thus threatening England's domination of the seas. Anyway, in September 1789, Lord Dorset, who was England's ambassador in Paris, wrote that the chaos from the revolution meant that it would be a long time before France could return to any state of existence that would make France a subject of uneasiness to other nations. Of course, he did not anticipate Napoleon, but the theory was clear. And to conclude this remarkably scanty comparison of revolutions, for the mass mind, revolution means change through widespread violence. And I think this is a simplistic view. The COVID phenomenon is a revolution, except that the necessary and preliminary subversion in this, I would say, very novel case, came from the top down rather than from the bottom up. And it was a long incubation, as even a short perusal of the evidence shows or would show to those who are interested. Which proves how remarkably easy it is with fear, money and media monopoly to promote subversion and to create the mass mind required to install any order, even a new world order. Incidentally, the connection between so-called sexual liberation and revolution had been brought into evidence in the United States as far as back as 1954, when a government commission was set up to investigate the source of the funding of Kinsey, the author of the Kinsey Reports, promoting unrestrained sexual license. Who, Mr. Kinsey, was a Freudian and, like Freud, a pervert. And I quote from a 1954 government report. Subversion does not refer to outright revolution, but to the promotion of tendencies that lead, in their inevitable consequences, to the destruction of principles through perversion or alienation. Subversion in modern society is not a sudden cataclysmic explosion, but a gradual undermining, a persistent chipping away at foundations upon which beliefs rest. It is no exaggeration to state that in the field of social sciences, many major projects which have been most prominently sponsored by foundations have been subversive. That report could have been written yesterday or today. Consider the current cultural movements founded at the tune of millions of dollars, and you may reach similar conclusions. Thank you for watching. See you next time, and as always, may all the number of the stars give light to your fair way. Good night.